You're listening to Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technology in the food and supplement industries, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams. Let's jump right in. Welcome to another episode of Food Tech Talk. Today, we're joined by Leanne Singleton, a renowned food industry specialist with over 20 years of experience spanning all sectors of the food supply chain. Currently the principal food safety, food waste specialist at FoodSure Australia, Leanne has also made significant contributions as a food safety advisor at Food Legal and as a GFSI food safety auditor and trainer at BSI. Her expertise encompasses food safety risk management, food loss and waste reduction, and regulatory compliance, making her a pivotal figure in the shaping of the food industry and the future of sustainability. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you, Lydia.
So before we get started into our topical questions today, could you share a bit more about your journey in the food industry and what initially inspired you to focus on food safety and sustainability?
Sure. I think I've always loved all things food, and food safety was a magnet because it was so interesting. It was always changing. It was always evolving. I think in food safety, you could see that our food safety risks were going to change as the types of food we ate changed and the way we ate changed. So I was always very interested in food safety. Initially, at the start of my career, I'd hoped to work in new product development. It didn't work out that way when I found out I was celiac and I wouldn't be tasting new ingredients. So it pushed me into a path of initially regulatory compliance, which was an excellent grounding in due diligence. And then from there, I guess I kind of fell into a food safety role, working for a certification body for a period of time.
Yeah, and you've worked across various roles, within the industry, from auditing to advisory. So maybe you can tell us about a standout project or initiative that you were involved with that you're particularly proud of.
I love working in the development of standards. I know a lot of people would say, how could that be the pinnacle of your success, contributing to standards? But I love standards, whether they're in-house standards for a client, which is going to set a benchmark for them to measure themselves against, or whether it's a best practice standard. Standards is something we just keep coming back to time and time again to say, what is the benchmark we need to achieve? Or it might be, what is the framework we can work to improve what we're doing? So a current project I'm working on is an interim Australian standard for food loss and waste. And I'm very excited about that project being one of the first in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to dive in more on the food waste a little bit later in the interviews. Kind of getting into our main meat of our topic here, you've witnessed significant changes in food safety systems, over the past 2 decades. So maybe you could walk us through, I would say, the most critical advancements in preventative food safety systems that you've seen in the industry.
Oh, there's a lot of them. So I guess it spans over 2 decades. I think one of the first pivotal changes was when we moved from a reactive inspection-based food safety program, predominantly around regulatory compliance, through to our audit of systems for best practice management. And in this evolution, we saw people go from regulatory to HACCP and then on to prescriptive GFSI best practice standards. In that time, we also had all of the missing links, if you like, in the food chain, where we had food safety certification, not just for a manufacturing facility, but we had it for all of the sections in between, for contracted storage, for transport. And in that time, we also had a big push from retailers that were opening up the markets for retailer branded products. So through contracted manufacturing, we also had a huge focus and drive to improve food safety and quality for those products. So we truly moved from reactive to preventative in that time.
Do you have any examples that kind of stand out as turning points to make that move?
In terms of making that move, I think business had to look at whole food chain, holistic management of food safety. So instead of just looking at what do they need to do as a standalone business, they were looking at what do my suppliers need to do? What do my contracted storage providers and my contracted transport providers need to do? So I think there was a big shift in realizing that food safety management is across the supply chain, not just within an individual business. And the other thing, it's hard not to mention at this point, is that I think we came to the understanding that it wasn't just about having an excellent comprehensive food safety management system with all of these requirements clearly defined. It's about how people behave within that system. So I think there's been an enormous shift in our thinking to realise the importance of food safety culture and nurturing positive food safety behaviours within that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the food safety culture is really key. And I've heard that from so many guests on this show. At the beginning of the interview, you mentioned standards. So, standards like GFSI, BRCGS, and FSC 22000, they've become benchmarks in the industry. So, in your experience, how have these standards driven improvements in food safety and compliance?
They've all got HACCP as their backbone, but they've all built on HACCP requirements. And I think probably an example is allergen management. Undeclared allergens remain the leading cause of food recalls globally. So these standards have gone beyond HACCP, and they've looked at a whole series of prompts, if you like, as to what a business would need to consider, the risk assessments they need to do, and the controls they need to have in place to ensure that they're able to reduce their risk of allergen contamination or allergen cross contact. So I think they give an excellent rule book on what you need to do as a food business. And beyond looking at preventative food safety management, having some prescriptive requirements in there that generate consistency across all businesses that use these standards.
When I think about businesses, especially global businesses, which, I'm here in the US, you're in Australia, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the challenges that businesses typically face when trying to achieve these standards, and how can they overcome them?
It's a really good question, Lydia, because I think to do any standard well, it requires resources. So it needs people's time, it needs technical expertise, and it needs a real commitment to continual improvement. You won't always have a best practice system when you first start out. You will need to build on that. And I think it's giving people the authority and the responsibility to build on the systems that they have. There's many times as an auditor that I would walk into a business and see that the technical manager there was babysitting an inefficient HACCP system. It's there to be challenged, it's there to be changed, and that your system is always evolving. And if it's not evolving, it means that there's too much reliance on a past history of compliance. So it is about looking forward and looking at how you can future-proof what you do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that approach. How have you seen, amongst your clients, adhering to these standards, how has that transformed their organizations for the better?
I've seen a shift where we have had a complete change in expectations, but it's been a change in expectation across all levels in the business. So I think previously there was certainly the perception that food safety was owned by middle management. And now we see that food safety is actually driven from leadership, and that it's at all levels of the organisation. It doesn't just live in food safety and quality departments. So we've seen that it's integrated across everything a business does. And if food is your business, it's so critical that you protect your food safety reputation, because any lapse in food safety could have disastrous consequences, not only for your brand, but it may be the end of your business. And so I've seen these standards used to not only set benchmarks, but for businesses to go over and above, and to see this as an opportunity to have a competitive advantage by being best in class.
A lot of times we talk about, how these requirements are not just driven by regulatory, but they're driven by the consumer, who's demanding to see these changes, right? So with the regulations continuing to evolve, what strategies should food businesses adopt, in terms of future-proofing their compliance efforts and looking into what comes next?
My first tip to businesses would be, if you have a BRCGS standard, or you have an FSSC standard, or you have an SQF standard, for example, they're all GFSI standards, have a look at the current edition of standard or version of standard, and everything that is a should, have a look at that with the view that in the next iteration of that standard, it might in fact be a shall. So that's the way of introducing a number of requirements. As standards are revised every couple of years, shoulds become shalls and a new bunch of shoulds come in. The other thing is, I would say to any business, have a look at global food safety incidents and global recalls to give you a clue on what risk management might be needed in the future. And I think the best example of this, and it's an older example now, but the horse meat scandal that we had in the UK, when that happened and when that was revealed, that was brand new for the industry. And so obviously the next version of all of those GFSI standards had some rigorous requirements around everybody doing some food fraud vulnerability assessments for their ingredients and across their supply chains. So that can also be an important clue as to what's coming next.
Good point. It's just ever evolving, based on what's happening. And this is one of my favorite topics. So technology, what role does technology play in helping businesses to get there and stay ahead of these changes and, really be prepared for that next thing?
I think the most important thing that technology is going to allow is data-led decisions. I think so many times we're thinking about what's our perceived risk without knowing what our actual risk is. So as we evolve and we move to better and more sophisticated data collection across all of our monitoring points, we will be able to accurately determine what the real likelihood of that hazard is of occurring. We'll be able to look for trends that give us clues as to where we need to redirect our focus or our resources. So I think the power will be in data-led decision making.
I absolutely agree. I think that, companies are going to need that data in order to be able to move through, not just the regulations, like I said, but, the need that the consumer is pushing and being in this mission of food safety. So certainly agree with you on that. You mentioned food safety a little bit earlier, food safety culture specifically, within organizations. How can businesses integrate compliance into the core values, and put that into their daily operations to ensure long-term success with a food safety culture?
I've always looked to other successful programs that have been implemented. And I think moving away from food safety for just a moment, work health and safety programs in business have been able to achieve a phenomenal level of compliance and also have had a significant improvement in reducing the number of workplace injuries that we have. So looking at that system to say what has worked really well in that system, what stands out to me is near miss reporting. So many times in food safety, there would be a whole series of incidents that would lead up to a food safety incident occurring. However, there was no mechanism where people were saying, actually, I've seen that almost happen before. So I think the two most successful things I've seen work in terms of driving compliance and food safety culture are implementing a near miss reporting system where we almost had a breach of food safety, but we caught it. So reporting that and sharing that learning within the site and perhaps across all of the sister sites if it's part of a global business. And the other one is nominating and recognising positive food safety behaviours. So having a food safety champion, having somebody who is very visible in the organisation of championing food safety, and also recognising when people go above and beyond and they do the right thing, having a recognition program for that. I always think that somebody that feels appreciated is going to do so much more than what is expected of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of speaks to, how you'll know that you successfully implemented a strong food safety culture. But are there any, KPIs or any ways to track, hey, we've done this right, we've implemented this and it's moving? Because I think that's it's really like that for culture in general, right? Like, how do you know that it's working? So what are some thoughts for organizations on that front?
I always think in its simplest term, food safety culture is what do people do when nobody is looking? So in terms of setting some targets around that, I feel that education is a really big piece where people need to know why they're doing what they're doing and to understand the consequences if that doesn't happen. I think so engagement in training and the effectiveness of training is key. Also think in looking at the number of actual food safety incidents. Are they reducing? Are they increasing is important. Looking at the effectiveness of the near miss reporting system, and are we actually taking those learnings and making the changes in a truly preventative way for that. And I also think it's around setting some KPIs around how can we work collaboratively, and collaboration is key, with our suppliers to help them improve their food safety culture, and perhaps with our service providers, how can we work with them to raise their food safety culture as well, because they are going to impact our business. So it's not just our food safety culture within our business, it's how we can also partner with others and take them with us.
I absolutely love that, and that's something that we definitely believe in here at Trustwell. Is it's we're all connected, and the supplier piece is so key in terms of ensuring that food safety and that culture that goes across your entire business and everything you're doing. So I love that. So changing gears a little bit, to talk about food waste. It's something you mentioned earlier. Reducing food waste is both an environmental and economic imperative. So based on your work with FoodSure and BSI, what are some innovative approaches or technologies that have proven effective in minimizing food waste across the supply chain?
I think one of the first challenges is that we need to recognise food waste when we see it. And I guess my interest in food waste actually occurred while working as a food safety auditor to GFSI standards. I realised that an unintended consequence of having these very high level food safety standards is that it could unintentionally drive some food waste as well. So as we got better and better and better, and we had more and more stringent specifications for all of our raw materials and for our finished products, we also had systems in place to make sure that should we have food waste, that we had secure destruction of it so that nobody could reuse those products. But in doing so, I think we also drove some waste in that process. So I think strategies for a business are to challenge what waste actually is in their business. And while working at some businesses, they said, I never actually thought about food waste until you were about to come on site. And I suddenly looked around and I saw it everywhere, but I'd never seen it before. One of the simplest things a business can do is they need to target food waste as something that they're going to look at. They need to measure how much waste they have. And a lot of businesses, they have a perceived expectation of what they think their waste is, and then there's the actual. So I think it's a little bit like food fraud. When you look for it, you always find it. So if you're looking for food waste, you will see where you have hotspots, either within your own process, where you have a waste output that is what we would call a hotspot because of either the volume of waste or the value of that waste. And then when you see that, looking at your opportunity to say, okay, how can I get leverage off existing systems I have? Can we nominate this for a continuous improvement project where we're going to specifically target action at this hotspot? Or can I engage with my new product development team? Is there an opportunity to repurpose what would have gone to food waste into a new product or to add value to that? So it's not about doing anything new. It's about leveraging what you already have.
Wow, that's an awesome way to think about that. So could you share some success stories that you've had in terms of, thinking of food waste in this different way, and how that has, actually significantly reduced the waste that a company is producing?
It's on two levels. So I think the first one is reducing food waste within your own business. And the other one is reducing it across your supply chain. So I think there's huge opportunities for businesses to say, once we tackle food waste within our business, and what I have seen working with clients is then they turn it to a supply chain exercise to say, and again, collaboration is key, just as it is with food safety culture. It's the same in reducing food waste. So it's getting your suppliers in the same room as you, and perhaps also your service providers, right through to your retailers, to say, in the same room, let's look at supply chain mapping. What happens to our products as they move through the supply chain? What are the communication channels? Where are the hotspots in the supply chain that we all need to collaboratively work on? If organizations don't do that in partnership, there's a risk that you might move the food waste from one part of the supply chain to another. And that was never the intent. The intent is is to reduce it across the supply chain, not just shift it to somebody else. So the most impact has actually come from supply chain collaboration, where everybody in the supply chain can do small incremental changes that collectively together result in a big impact. So if we're looking at an agricultural product, that starts at the farm. It starts at harvest of produce. Then it moves on to the transport of how do we handle those fresh produce products through every stage of transport to the processor. Once they arrive at the processor, how do we treat them so that we maintain their food safety and quality? Once they're processed, how do we optimize those products getting out to market without having any food safety impacts, which would also be a driver for food loss? So I see food waste and food safety are linked, because we can't allow a product to become unsafe, because that in turn drives waste, because we can't do anything with the product that has become unsafe. So it's about, I think, collaboration across the supply chain.
And that makes a lot of sense, but then there's also the economic factor, and you had mentioned in your article that you wrote with Todd Redwood at BSI that there's a 14-fold return on investment for businesses that invest in reducing that food waste. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that benefit and, how that works for companies that are implementing food waste reduction strategies?
So that statistic actually comes from WRI, the World Resource Institute, and they found on average for a company to invest in reduction of food waste, they had an increased yield because they've reduced waste. It might be that they've seen an opportunity where they can repurpose a product that previously would have gone to animal feed at a significantly reduced rate. They can actually salvage that product, they can protect it from contamination, and that they can repurpose it or upcycle that to a new value stream. It might be that food waste was going straight to a landfill application, and they've now been able to divert that to a black soldier fly operation, where it's then converted into larvae, which is sold on as another product for aquaculture. So it's about looking at opportunities for reduction, which obviously will increase your profit, because you'll be converting more product, more materials into product. It's also about repurposing. So repurposing something that would have gone to waste to another product to create a value stream. And it's also about redirecting it. So how do you valorize that? And it could even be that you're able to redirect surplus food to food rescue organizations. So that doesn't become something that you pay waste disposal on. It's something that is donated and it's removed from the waste stream.
Wow, awesome ideas. And for companies that are looking at how they can accurately measure and track the economic benefit of investing in food waste reduction, what are some good ways that they can implement that in their companies?
The measurement piece, look, there are several tools out there to do that. The measurement piece could start simple. I think that there's been some resistance in industry to say, we have so many things we need to do right now. We're a bit overwhelmed with everything we need to do. And now we need to turn around and start tracking food waste. It doesn't need to be down to the last kilo or the last gram. So what a business needs to start is just at the most basic level to say, right, how many of our ingredients that we receive never get converted into saleable product? What volume of waste is that? How many ingredients we have in storage that actually don't, that through perhaps incorrect storage practices or a lack of effective stock rotation never get converted into finished product? In our process, how much waste comes off our process, either due to the design of the process, perhaps the equipment causes damage to product, perhaps we've got issues with technology that we use, like optical sorters, that if there's too much condensate, they go blind and they start rejecting good product. So it's looking at all of those incremental stages to say, how many raw materials do we buy in that never actually get out the door? And what's the true cost of that? So it's not just the cost of the material, it's the lost opportunity cost as well. And when businesses start tracking that, they'll often find that in their first year of tracking that, they come up with a figure of total food waste, and then they'll look at where the designations go to. Does it go to landfill? Does it go to composting? Does it go to animal feed? But in their second year of reporting, they get better at it. And so sometimes they actually have more food waste reported the second year, not because they're producing any more waste, they're just more accurate in their ways of recording that waste. So I would say to organisations, don't be discouraged. You have to start somewhere. Even if you started at product in, product over the weighbridge, and you look at that very crude approximation, it'll be better than doing nothing.
A lot of what you've been speaking to also kind of goes alongside sustainability. I know a lot of, food companies face numerous sustainability challenges, from resource management to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what do you see as the biggest sustainability challenges for the food industry? And what opportunities exist for businesses to address these challenges effectively?
I think the challenges are numerous. It is, in one, effective use of resources, and reducing food waste is part of that. And I think that's probably the easiest thing for businesses to tackle. First up is to say, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, reducing our food waste is going to go a very long way to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I believe that there's going to be an increasing focus on responsible use of water, which is also in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, as we move from cycles of droughts to floods, we're going to have, a huge focus move to responsible use of water. And I think moving towards net zero is going to be lots of small incremental steps, I think, and that's going to take time. The other big challenge is, I think, shifting away from our linear food chain to a more circular economy. And what does that look like for food? And what is possible in that space? So I have seen some amazing examples of food businesses wanting to get ahead on this, and they've invested heavily in renewable energy. They've looked at food waste not only within their businesses but across their supply chain. They're already looking at how they can minimise their use of water. So I do think there is action on this front, but it needs to be across all food sectors.
Totally agree. Looking ahead, what type of emerging trends or innovations in sustainability do you think are going to have the most significant impact on the food sector as a whole?
And I'm not an expert on greenhouse gas emissions, but I do think that as more and more businesses have a regulatory obligation to start reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, I think that is going to drive a lot of industry focus to say, how can we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? But setting in place accurate accounting for that. So there's certainly some systems that are already in place in the UK, looking at greenhouse gas emissions for different types of food across different industry sectors. But we will need to, I guess, get a database for that, which is applicable across multiple different countries, so that there's some consistency in that accounting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you hit on the head with global standards are really important in this area. Another thing to think about with both sustainability and food safety is continuous improvement. So what are some best practices that you would recommend for businesses that are looking to continuously enhance their food safety protocols and, at the same time, their sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, look, it's something I mentioned before. It's leveraging their existing systems. So I think it's looking at the opportunities to, in the scope of what you look at in continuous improvement programs, it is building in not just process efficiency, which tends to be the scope of a lot of continuous improvement projects. It's looking at how can we improve the efficiency of our processes, but it's saying, how can we look at maintaining high standards of food safety? How can we look at reducing food waste? Getting that leverage on systems you already have. And it is engaging with other functions in the business to say that sometimes in large businesses, everyone's in siloed departments talking to each other to say, collaboratively as a group, what can we come up with some innovative solutions? And I think continual improvement is also reflecting on what you have achieved, taking the learnings from that and applying them to future projects as well, because none of those projects really happen in isolation. And so it's building on your experience, sharing those learnings within the group of your companies, and perhaps even mentoring others so that you can have lots of small incremental change that can be sustained.
Yeah, and I love that you also mentioned, looking back at where you've been, where you've come from, at all of the improvements that you've made, because I feel like with a lot of fast-paced organizations, sometimes we don't, take the time to do that. And it's a really important part of that continuous improvement. And, you mentioned using the systems you have. What about for companies that are implementing new systems and standards? Because there's oftentimes resistance within organizations to change. How can those companies overcome that resistance? And what strategies have you seen be really effective in fostering a culture that embraces change?
It comes down to understanding principles of change management and how to apply those. And it also comes down to planning for change. So many of the standards have requirements around how an organization plans for change. And sometimes I think people skip over those and they think that's standards talk. What do you mean I've got to plan for change? It's just going to happen. But what it's trying to say is that for change to be sustained, an enormous amount of work needs to go into the planning stages for that, to say, what is the best way to implement this change? How can we make sure this change isn't going to have an unintended impact on food safety? So if we're doing a process change, how do we know it's not going to impact food safety compliance, or that it's going to increase the amount of food waste that we have? So some of the best systems I've seen have actually been a formalized change management process that is cross-functional in the organization. So before the change is implemented, there's a lot of consultation across the business as to what the best way to proceed is, what the impacts could be, what are the things that we need to put in place before we make the change, so the transition to that change doesn't create a whole lot of unintended impacts or consequences. And I think from a cultural perspective, it's everybody being informed of that process and knowing what to anticipate. I've certainly seen examples of where the change doesn't go well, and it might be that the workforce hasn't been consulted on the technology change, and suddenly you have people doing all of these workarounds because they don't understand the technology. And so you definitely want to make sure that we've got engagement for the people who are going to be impacted by the change.
Cross-functional planning is so important in all of food safety, really. Any of these initiatives, I feel like you can't do it alone, and you definitely need that cross-functional support. So that's a great point as well. So I know we've talked about a lot of different things. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to add to this conversation about food safety culture, sustainability, food waste, any of that?
I think it's an observation that I had from 20 years of auditing, and I never intended on being an auditor. So people say, how did you become an auditor? I said, I don't think anybody says I'm going to be an auditor. It evolves. But I absolutely loved auditing. It was the opportunity to be, as a friend called it, a food industry tourist, to go in and see so many different processes. And I think in that time, what I took away from that is that for everybody that's in the food industry, every time you see a new process, or you look at a new product, or you meet new people in the food industry, reflect on what you've learned from that, because there's a learning. And many times I walked away from an audit and I thought, I feel I got more out of that than perhaps my client did, because I have learned so many new things in looking at that process. And I think the other important point I'd just like to make is it's really important to challenge your food safety and challenge your food waste initiatives, and don't get complacent, because they should always be changing and evolving, and there's always something new on the horizon that you need to be thinking about and looking at how you're going to incorporate that into what you do, not just staying the same. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for evolving systems.
Awesome. That's such good advice. So now for just a couple fun questions. So who in the world of, food safety or within the food industry would you most like to take to lunch?
Well, that's a good question. I think first of mind is Frank Yanis. I think because he's such a strong advocate for food safety culture, and I think my interest is that America's had a different journey to food safety and have had different challenges. And that's always interesting to compare and contrast the different types of challenges. And I look to different countries and I think, is that a glimpse into the future for us? Where we see intensive agriculture, is that something that is going to come into play? globally and that will have the same types of food safety challenges. So he was certainly somebody. But if I'm allowed to take two people, somebody who was very influential at the start of my career was Kimberly Carey Coffin. And, I would love to catch up with her again. She's now at LRQA. And she was very influential and technically was excellent in her understanding of the standards and what the intent was behind every standard. And I never forgot that. Look at the requirement. What's the intent? Not just the literal interpretation of the requirement.
So you've already given some really solid advice, but, thinking back on your career, what would you say to a new leader in the food safety industry, and especially someone who's kind of looking to go into what you've done with, changing organizations and food safety culture and making a strong impact?
You'll always have your technical knowledge, and there's always, new training courses you can do to build knowledge. But I think it's also just as important to think about the skill set that you need. So, doing a professional development course in change management, project management, has been and public speaking are all important skills to develop because you're going to need them as a food safety advocate. So I would say to people, don't just focus on your knowledge, look at the skill set you need and look around for opportunities for professional development in your skill set so that you can actually match up your knowledge with the skills to deliver that.
Fantastic. Well, Leanne, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. This has been super enlightening, and I know our listeners really appreciate it, and so did I. So thanks so much for joining us on Food Tech Talk.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. To learn more about Trustwell and its technology platform that connects product formulation, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit www.trustwell.com. Thanks for listening.